Good morning, and welcome to another edition of United Way for Southeastern Michigan's What's the Word Wednesdays. My name is Courtney Howe, and today we are going to be talking about the anniversary of the Americans with Disability Act and how to recognize and combat ableism. The last 10 minutes of today's conversation are reserved for questions, so please leave your questions in the Q&A box if you're watching on Zoom or in the comment box on Facebook. Now, I would like to welcome Tanya Adair, United Way's Chief People Equity and Engagement Officer. Tanya, welcome.
Thank you so much, Courtney. This month marks the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disability Act. While this landmark legislation was designed to positively impact the lives of people with disabilities by ensuring the same rights and opportunities as anyone else, many people across our region still faced obstacles to full and equal participation in their community because of barriers to accessible housing, good jobs, safe environments, equitable education, and reliable transportation. To guarantee the full inclusion of people with disabilities in Metro Detroit, we must address the policies and systems that still exist that leave many behind. Today, we're excited to welcome Dessa Cosma, Executive Director of Detroit Disabilities Power, an organization dedicated to engaging in the work that affects people with disabilities. Dessa grew up in the Deep South, like myself, splitting her time between New Orleans, Louisiana, fellow Louisiana native, and Augusta, Georgia. She's been a social justice activist for as long as she can remember, starting her environmental LGBTQ and reproductive justice efforts in high school. Can you believe it? After graduating college, Dessa moved to Detroit, where has worked with Planned Parenthood, the Center for Progressive Leadership, and the Economic Justice Alliance of Michigan, which she helped to start in collaboration with some of Detroit's most dedicated economic and racial justice champions. In 2018, Dessa started Detroit Disability Power to grow the organizing power of the disability community and continue bridging the gap between the disability community and larger social justice movements. Dessa attended the University of Georgia, where she earned a bachelor's degree or bachelor's degrees in international affairs, women's studies, and anthropology. So impressive. She also holds a master's in social justice from Marygrove College. Dessa, welcome, and thank you for joining us to talk about the Americans with Disabilities and how we can be better allies for better rights allies.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I'm so glad to be here. As was stated, my name is Dessa Cosma. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Executive Director of Detroit Disability Power. For those of you who can see me on a little Zoom screen or on Facebook, you can see that I'm a white woman with blonde hair, wearing a pink t-shirt in front of a brick wall on my back porch. And what I just did is called a visual description. So for people who are listening but can't see, that gives them equal access to the information that those of you who can see have when listening and watching me speak. And so this is just one of the many kind of micro practices that we can all take on in our virtual existence to make it more accessible to people with a variety of disabilities. And throughout the next half an hour, I'm sure I'll point out a couple of other small practices, and I really invite you all to try them on and start including them in your daily practice, because those are the kind of things that when we all take responsibility for creating collective access, it really does move the needle for disabled people who are often inadvertently neglected or left out. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here. And you know, as I was thinking about what I could share with you all in a short amount of time, you know, one of the first things that really came to mind was a little bit of a story of how Detroit Disability Power came to be. And as Tanya said, I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up very low income with a single parent. I grew up culturally very different than most of the folks around me. I had very progressive family. I have a family that's not Christian. And so religiously and politically, we were different than most of the people that we were interacting with. And I'm a person with a disability. So you can't tell on Zoom, but I'm a little person. I'm about 3.5 feet tall. I'm also a wheelchair user. And so I'm very noticeably disabled, except for on Zoom. And so why that's relevant is I just realized as a very young kid that the world was really designed for some people to succeed and for some people to not really matter, right? And I think that disability offers a really interesting opportunity, a really kind of concrete, understandable way of understanding systemic barriers, right? And so the barriers that someone in a wheelchair, for example, face, they are cultural, they are attitudinal, right? And we're going to talk more about that, but they're also like physical, right? So if a building doesn't have a ramp and has a set of stairs, anyone could understand why someone like me can't get in the building, right? That kind of concrete, very tangible barrier, I think, is an opportunity for us to think more broadly about barriers that impact folks that in ways that are very consequential, life or death, but are sometimes less visible to someone who doesn't experience them. And so, you know, a lifetime of navigating a world that was not designed for someone like me to get around or to succeed, even at a young age, I realized like, wow, this is super unfair. And this isn't just happening to me, right? This is happening to lots of different types of people for a variety of reasons that are systemic. And so growing up feeling very different than the people around me in many ways was a huge insight as a young person. And I think definitely propelled my career in social justice. And so, as was also mentioned, you know, I've had this like really incredible experience professionally to work on things that matter deeply to me. So reproductive justice, racial justice, economic justice. And I was doing all of that work enthusiastically, you know, and also though, as a disabled person. And so often in those spaces, I would say almost entirely in those spaces, I was the only person that was obviously disabled. And I was almost always the only person who was ever bringing up disability issues. And this is one of the ways that ableism functions, right? Most non-disabled people don't really think about disability much, don't really know much about our lives or our culture. And because disability is a taboo subject, it doesn't get discussed or brought up in as much as it really needs to for us to move the needle on issues. People with disabilities, particularly disabled folks that have other marginalized identities, whether that be they're people of color or LGBTQ or low income or immigrant, people with disabilities are at the bottom of every quality of life index that you could look at. And what's really important to know about that is there's nothing about that that's inevitable. There's nothing that says disabled people automatically have a less happy, less wealthy, less healthy, shorter life, right? Like there's nothing inevitable about that. That is systemic oppression, and that the systemic oppression that's harming disabled people specifically is called ableism. And ableism, like other systemic oppression, operates at the personal level. So the way we feel about disability, our beliefs and value system, which we may have said out loud or may have never said out loud. We may have been taught explicitly, or we may have just picked up. The interpersonal level, which is how we treat each other. Do we make fun of disabled people? Do we talk down to disabled people? Do we talk to them like infants, even though they're adults, right? These are all things that happen to me regularly. Do we ask overly invasive personal questions about somebody's body or medical experience? That's ableism too. So the interpersonal level is really important. We also have the institutional level, and that's why it's so great to see United Way doing conversations like this. Every institution reflects the values of mainstream culture unless it's trying really hard not to. And so we have a very ableist mainstream culture institutions, whether it's a PTA, block club, or the city of Detroit government, right? Everything in between, all have to consciously dismantle ableism within their organizations. That means reviewing hiring policies and HR practices, making sure that the workspace is accessible, that people have the accommodations that are required by law, right? Like there's a whole bunch of things that we can do to make sure our institutions are serving the more than 20% of our population that are disabled. And then culture, at the cultural level, we're talking about ableism as it shows up in media representation, what we consider beautiful or normal, what we believe is right as a culture. And one way to think about this is, how many times have you ever seen a disabled person on the front of a magazine? How many times have you seen a movie where a disabled person is represented as a full and complex character played by a disabled actor, right? If you can answer those questions easily, you are in the minority because those things are all too infrequent. So we have ableism operating at these various levels. And as Tanya said, this landmark legislation of the Americans with Disabilities Act is huge because it's civil rights legislation, right? We have some other federal policy that also helps with things like building codes, making sure that things are built accessibly, particularly those that get any sort of subsidies from the government. But the ADA really protects our civil rights, and that's very important because we're also a highly discriminated against group of people. So just a couple more thoughts before I wrap it up. I just want to mention that I started Detroit Disability Power because of all of this, because I was even facing ableism in social justice spaces. And it wasn't overt, mean kind of discrimination. It was a lack of consciousness, a lack of consideration, not understanding that disabled people are a constituency that we should be really courting and organizing like we do other groups of folks who are fighting against injustice. And so Detroit Disability Power, we really focus on building the political power of the disability community locally, because I don't see another path to us getting what we need except for exercising power and getting more people with disabilities into positions of power, whether that be governmental positions, elected positions, or the leadership in influential organizations. And so we do a lot to that end of building power. We invite all of you to join us in the organizing. We also do consulting work for nonprofits, businesses, et cetera, who want a deep dive to make sure their organization is dismantling ableism. And we offer anti-ableism workshops for anybody that wants them to really dig into these topics more. So that's some of what we do. And we're a membership organization. We want to make sure that we're grounded in our local community and making decisions based on the priorities of Detroiters with disabilities. And the final thing I'll say is in Detroit, currently there are more than 128,000 disabled residents. That's a really big part of our population that doesn't get nearly the attention or resources needed, particularly in this old city, which is not particularly user-friendly for people with a variety of disabilities. So we need to do better by this 128,000 residents. I'll also say that out of those residents, 106,000 are African American and a majority are women. So this is obviously a very intersectional space where we can really, we really have to address problems with an intersectional analysis, because not everybody's experience is the same. And we have a lot of work to do, not only to make the world work for the broad diversity of people with disabilities, but also remembering that all of us also have a race and a gender and a sexual orientation, et cetera. So it's complex, but it's exciting. And I think I just am so grateful to do this work every day. And I invite all of you to join us.
Dessa, thank you so much for that information. We see we already have a lot of questions that are coming into the chat, so we're really excited to get started. And again, I want to remind people, if you have any more questions, please comment on Facebook or put in the chat function if you're watching via Zoom. Our first question that we have for you is, so how should we address ableism when we see it? If we're seeing any discrimination, or how do we make sure we're uplifting your voice and making sure that you're heard and being valued?
Sure. Thank you for the question. This is Dessa. So, you know, this is a thing that takes practice, right? Just like those of us who are white have a responsibility of calling out or calling in people when we witness racism happening. I think non-disabled people need to get skilled up, need to practice, and need to be ready to address ableism when they see it. And just like other forms of oppression, ableism, you know, shows up constantly in many, many different ways, some of which are subtle and some of which would, you know, slap you over the face. So I think the first thing that non-disabled people particularly can do, if they haven't already, is to do some reading, start paying attention to what disabled people are saying. There's on our website, I think this can be put in the chat, there's a list of resources about disability, ableism, and autism. Autism is discrimination based on lack of ability to hear. So this is something that primarily affects deaf and hard of hearing and deaf blind people. And it's similar to ableism, but it's more specific. And those resources provide a good opportunity to watch some films, read some articles, get some book recommendations on these things. So getting skilled up, learning, and then obviously building relationships with disabled people, a variety of disabled people, because again, we are a super diverse group of people. And you know, just knowing what a wheelchair user's life is like does not actually make us understand what somebody with an intellectual disability's life are like, or a mental health disability. So it requires us to really think, to think complexly. And then, you know, after some learning, after some relationship building, and even while you're doing those things, if you encounter ableism, I think just figuring out what is the best way for me to address this in this moment. Is it to say something like, that doesn't really seem fair, or I think that's a stereotype, or it makes me uncomfortable the way that you said that? Like, even those kind of like not that intense comments can make a person think twice. And then depending on the situation, right, there's so many ways that ableism shows up. It's a little hard for me to give advice broadly, but I think we can't let it slide, right? Like, we have a responsibility not to let it slide, because while a comment may seem not that big of a deal, something like calling somebody crazy, for example, or making fun of the way a person moves or speaks, those things significantly add up for the disabled person. I will tell you that from personal experience. But they also double down on a culture that understands us to be deficient. And we are not deficient. We are different. And that's a really important distinction. And so when we witness ableism, we do have to say something, even if you're not sure what to say, you have to say something so that we can start pushing back on this dominant culture.
I really appreciate you for sharing those tools that we can utilize in our daily, you know, lives in society, or even at the workplace. We really appreciate that. Speaking of resources, are there resources available for young children to have these early conversations about ableism?
A great question. Not as many as there should be is the short answer. You know, I primarily don't work in a youth space, so there may be lots of things I don't know about. What I do know from talking to adults, including parents, is that they wish there was more of that. And when I look back on my own life, I certainly didn't learn anything about disability in school. I didn't, you know, like, until I started studying these things on my own, I mean, I had my own personal experience, but we do need to talk to young kids about this. And I'll give you a really short story. Every time I go to the grocery store, I encounter children and they're very curious, and I love that about children. But what I see happening pretty much all the time is that their parents don't know what to do with their curiosity about me. And so a lot of times what will happen is a kid will like point at me and say, Mom, look at her. She's weird, or she's short, or she's different, you know, whatever kids say. One time I got called an elf. That was actually a highlight for me because it was funny, but mostly it's just weird comments from strangers. And so, you know, the parents often pull their kid away and shush them and just run in the opposite direction because they're embarrassed and because they don't want to hurt my feelings, right? Here's the thing. What that inadvertently teaches a kid is that we don't talk to those people. We don't look at those people. We definitely don't engage those people. In fact, we run the opposite direction. And those kind of messages to kids are really powerful and show up in the way that they treat me as adults later, right? And so what would be better is to say, oh yes, look at, you know, that's a different way of moving. That's a wheelchair. Or, oh, don't you like her dress? Or why don't you say hello or tell her your name? Like whatever makes sense in the moment to actually connect the kid would be far more beneficial than just running away. And not all disabled people are going to want to talk to a random person in the grocery store, but at least treating them with that respect is better than just running away.
Again, you're providing a lot of great tools for our listeners and ourselves, you know, to, you know, really learn how to engage and how to have that awareness with just not only ourselves, but our children as well. So we appreciate that. Again, our questions are hot in the chat box. So another one we have, how do I advocate against something like the recent changes to Michigan insurance law that disallows my support staff from driving my accessible van?
Yeah, this is Dessa. Thank you. That's a very, so I should have said this in the beginning. There are many of you with disabilities watching right now, and I certainly don't speak for everyone's experience. And it's good for all of us to remember that there are always disabled people around. We may not know, they may not tell us, but it's really important to keep that in mind. You know, in terms of a policy like that, this is why we have to build power. This is why we have to organize together and run campaigns. And so if you're interested in that kind of thing, please join Detroit Disability Power. You can email me, you can go to our website or social media. Because of the timing of the start of Detroit Disability Power and the pandemic, we actually didn't work much on this particular policy, but it would have been excellent for us to do more organizing on that, because these are the kind of consequences that people who are making policies, if they're not hearing from disabled people, they're not thinking of, right? They're not thinking about support staff driving vans because they're not thinking about support staff necessarily, or an inability to drive oneself, or the logistics of being disabled. And so we have to tell them. And that usually requires putting pressure on decision makers, and that's how organizing works. So coming together, coming up with a plan, putting pressure on the person who makes the decision, and letting them know what we need and why. That's the kind of organizing that we do at Detroit Disability Power.
And, you know, I appreciate you mentioning that, because another question was, can you share how or if Detroit Disability Power is working toward inclusive design efforts in the city of Detroit specifically?
Yeah, this is Dessa. We definitely are. So that we do that in a variety of ways. Excuse me. Along with other disability organizations in Detroit, we fought very hard and actually won an Office of Disability Affairs in the city government. So there were 44 departments in the city. Like I said, 128,000 disabled residents, but not a single person whose job was to look out for us or make sure we had an equal shot at what the city had to offer. We organized and got an Office of Disability Affairs, which now has several staff and has been in operation since the beginning of this year. That the goal of that office is to ensure that the city is designing its programs and infrastructure in an accessible way to people with a variety of disabilities. And while we have laws on the books that ensure accessibility and infrastructure and government programs to a degree, it's a bare minimum. And so we actually need people paying attention beyond that bare minimum to make things actually user-friendly and relevant to us. So we do that kind of design work through our efforts with the city and the Office of Disability Affairs. We also, like I mentioned earlier, have a fee-for-service consulting program where institutions of whatever size can hire us to help them design programs and infrastructure in an accessible, inclusive way. And then we also partner with organizations around the city to uplift these issues to their constituencies and to help them get thinking about how to be more intersectional in their work so that their work is more inclusive and accessible to people with a variety of disabilities.
Thank you again for that. I know some of those resources were, I was unaware of, that you all, have consulting work to help people understand and learn about, the disparities and how to combat that. Another question we have is, do you have suggestions for finding talent in the Metro Detroit area who have disabilities?
Sure, and I'm not going to be able to rattle off all of these off the top of my head, but if someone were to email me, I could follow up. So there are organizations that specifically train and help place disabled workers. And the Autism Alliance has an employment program. I'm forgetting the name of this other one right now. There's several depending on the sector. So some are tech focused, some are more broad. We are kind of pushing the city of Detroit to have a more disability specific program in the employment and training department. So sorry that I can't rattle them all off, but if you are interested, follow up with me and I'll get back to you.
Dessa, we appreciate you so much. And, we have ended the Q&A session for today. And what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Tanya to close out. And again, Dessa, thank you so much for joining us today. It's very much appreciated. Tanya?
Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. And thank you so much, Dessa. I've learned so much from just listening to you as well. So thank you for joining us today and for sharing all of the great information about how we can become better allies, better disability rights allies, and the great work that you're doing with Detroit Disability Power. So that's truly awesome. Just to share what I've learned, for those who are listening, I'm sitting in my home office in a brown office chair wearing a green blazer and green jewelry and brown reading glasses, just to give you a visual of Tanya and what Tanya is, how Tanya is coming before you today. So as a reminder, for anyone in our community who may be experiencing a need, including assistance with the impact of the recent flooding, our 211 helpline remains available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We maintain a running list of available services in the community and can connect you to the supports you need. You can also look up resources in your near area, in an area near you, using our 211 resource database at unitedwaysem.org/211. For the emergency broadband benefit, qualifying households can now receive a discount of up to $50 per month towards internet services and a one-time discount of up to $100 to purchase a digital device through the Federal Emergency Broadband Benefit. Applying is fast and easy. For more information and to apply, please call 313-241-7618. That's 313-241-7618. Please give them a call before the deadline, before the timeline is up and the money runs out. The funds are available as long as they last. So once they run out, this will be closed off. So please give them a call. Again, 313-241-7618. We will see you next week for another What's the Word Wednesday. To see our previous town halls and more upcoming topics, please visit unitedwaysem.org/virtual town halls. The website is also included in the chat box. So thank you, everyone. We will see you soon, and please stay safe and continue to live united.